Hello, and welcome to One-on-One with Robert Doar. I'm your host, Robert Doar, and thanks for tuning in today. As president of the American Enterprise Institute, I have the unique privilege of working with America's greatest policy experts. These scholars focus on policy issues in the fields of education, economics, energy, foreign and defense, and so much more. Subscribe to this podcast for exclusive access to in-depth discussions on the most pressing policy issues. Together, with my guests, we'll challenge political preconceptions, explore innovative ideas, and create, I hope, a freer and safer world. So today, we have the great pleasure of having John Fortier, who is, I think, America's foremost expert on elections and voting. He is the host of the Voting Booth podcast. He's an author of After the People Vote, a guide to the Electoral College. He's been writing about these issues, voting, the Electoral College, the process of elections in America for 20 years, 25 years, a long time. And he's a resident scholar at AEI. And given the attention that this issue gets, it's especially good that we have him here with us to sort of clear up the uncertainties and the misinformation and the stuff that's actually true. So, John, welcome. Thank you for being on One-on-One with Robert Doar.
Thank you, Robert.
So let's start out with sort of the question of voter fraud. And the definition of voter fraud, at least to me, would be someone who's not qualified to vote who votes and participates, or someone who is qualified to vote but votes multiple times, the old line, vote early, vote often in Chicago. How frequent is it? And what is it when it does happen?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think a simple answer to your question is it's not particularly frequent, and especially if we think about our history. If you go back and look at accounts of elections in the 1840s, 50s, we had a different kind of democracy, really lots of polling place fraud, lots of machine bosses, lots of questions about that today we would find unacceptable. I do think our big issue between the parties is often access versus integrity. And I think there are questions, reasonable questions about what we might do to make sure that only the people eligible vote. And those would come under voter fraud. And that doesn't mean that we're trying to solve a problem of mass millions of votes being cast in one direction that are inappropriate, but that there are a lot of reasonable things that you might ask, that someone be of the right age, that they be legal. If they're legally a citizen, that you might prove it, that you are live where you say you live, and that the system in looking for lots of access doesn't sort of forget about some of those priorities, which still are important parts of the system.
Okay, but John, you kind of, I mean, what you said there was there's not much of it, and certainly a lot less than there was in the old days when, after elections, we all united and said the system worked and we'll have the toleration of the opposition and we'll rally around whoever won the election. So we've got less of it, but we have more of this refusing to accept the outcome. One way of putting it, right? Okay, so let's go to the less of it. So where does it occur? Because there are some publications, the New York Times, the Brennan Center, they will say there are virtually no prosecutions of people for committing fraud in the United States. That can't be true.
Well, there are some prosecutions. I will say that I actually believe that both on the access and integrity sides, we've really stepped up our game in lots of ways historically. So I think people, when they talk about people being prevented from voting and access, that's a hard case to make. There are lots of options to vote in lots of ways. And when people say there are masses of people voting illegally, I think that's also untrue. But where I do think it happens is sort of in the messiness and complicatedness of elections. There are people who get on voter registration rolls who are not eligible to vote. Sometimes it's accidental. They're there, left on there because they're dead and they haven't been removed, or they're in two places because they've moved and it's a little bit messy. And most of the time that doesn't get taken advantage of by anybody, but it is a vulnerability that you might worry about.
Okay, so stop there. So again, one thing I have to let our listeners know is before I came to AI in my previous career, I was a political appointee for both a governor and a mayor. The governor I worked for was elected 3 times. I also worked on his state senate campaign, and the mayor I worked for was elected 3 times as well. So, I was involved in campaigns and elections, and so I know a little bit about the voting process. So let's talk about names on voting rolls that shouldn't be there. That happens. People die. People move, A and B. Are you saying to me that could be true? Could be true in any election district at any time, because people they're not cleansed every day. But that's not the same as saying, and yet that dead person or that absent person voted. So how does that happen? How would someone vote Robert Doar in Brooklyn if Robert Doar is not in Brooklyn, but his name is still on the roll?
Well, I mean, one set of places we have seen, and it's relatively rare, but there's some absentee voter fraud where someone is actually perhaps getting an absentee ballot sent to them to a name that's sort of dead on the list or they don't think is going to vote, and casting that ballot. Now, that's a pretty extreme case. We've seen some of that. There was a Miami mayoral race back in the late 90s where there was some of that was going on, enough of that the court said they weren't comfortable, and they actually threw out the race and made them run it again. So that was sort of an area where people worried about that. It can also be the questions of around the vote by mail where the ballot is out in the public rather than behind the curtain in the voting booth, that you might have people being a little pushy or using people at nursing homes or other places that you might not know how they're voting. Now, again, we don't think we see a lot of that, but that is a potential weakness. So I think out there are some potential weaknesses, and we've seen a few. I mean, again, just to say a few places, we have seen a few kind of very localized schemes. Sometimes in small towns, often for local races that nobody's really watching. That maybe there is a little bit of a vote buying regime or something like this. So there are little things out there. But I guess I want to say when there's a presidential election, to think that a concerted effort to move millions of votes in a way to change that seems very unlikely, the way we've been able to spot things and not really.
Well, John, you say seems very unlikely, but I guess my question would be, has it happened? In the millions.
I don't think so. No.
But how can you even say I don't think so? If there's no court record, if there's no evidence, if there's no proof that it happened, can you really say I don't? It still could happen, but it's right. I haven't seen it.
Well, I didn't mean to give that impression exactly. I meant to say that one can imagine, and one has seen things on small scale here and there.
I got it.
But getting, even if you were to sort of come up with an idea that somebody wanted to do this, it's a very complicated thing, and done at that scale would be determined. So I feel confident to say it hasn't happened, because it would be detected at that level. And even much of the smaller things are going to be detected, or sometimes just not worth your while. But
okay,
but what I will say is I do think there are some legitimate integrity issues that are part of our voting system, and sometimes those who push only for access sometimes don't take those seriously and think those are every little question of asking for cleaning lists or asking for proof of various eligibility is somehow keeping lots of people from voting. I think that's also really not true in today's
I
system.
completely agree. And we could talk access all day. I've talked about access before. The idea that we're anywhere close to the old Jim Crow South, or it's just preposterous. Stacey Abrams was completely wrong, and the people that make a fuss about the diminishment of access because of the courts rejecting Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act are just wrong. I got that. But I'm really, for this purpose of this conversation right now, I'm not talking about access. I'm talking about fraud. And let's just take a few counties. I don't know. I'm having in my mind in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, I think it's a Commonwealth.
It is.
I don't know what the counties are, whether it's Philadelphia County, but the city of Philadelphia, they will report results in the upcoming presidential election that will have a material impact on the results of that election. Will there be fraud in that report?
I don't think there will be large-scale fraud. If you mean there are little things here and there, I could believe it. I do think there are some ways in which we could criticize Philadelphia or just any place that's very one-sided politically, partly because our system depends on bipartisan people watching these polls, and any place that's really controlled by one party or the other, you're a little more worried that maybe there hasn't been that oversight. But those are, I think, somewhat more procedural things that I'd like to see, and I don't expect that we're seeing anything of large scale coming out of even a
well, that's
city
interesting
like
that you say
Philadelphia.
that, because in New York, in the elections I've been participated in, every voting place has an equal number of observers, and they're not just observers. There must be Democrats and Republicans overseeing the election process in that district. Is that not true in Philadelphia?
It's true, but true at some levels, right? So at every polling place, there's the option for both parties to be there. But actually, we do have some problems sometimes in places that are really overwhelming of not being able to get somebody of the other party, not somebody being there all day.
Okay.
I don't want to overstress that, but because I still think that's a part of the boards of elections all have at least one of each party
that's
on
what
them.
I was going to say. Don't the boards of
But
elections have?
we have a lot of polling places out there. We have a lot of activities, and so again, I'm going to put that in the category of not trying to be conspiratorial and think, oh, there's a lot going on that nobody was watching. But I think the watching process is a very good one that we should feel good about, that we have this kind of adversarial relationship that's in a lot of parts of the polling place, and it falls down a little bit in some of these places that are very one-sided.
Okay, one more question on this. District attorneys, United States attorneys, they're all over America. They're in red states and blue states. They are responsible for enforcing the law. Voter fraud or manipulation of voting rolls is illegal. Is there a clearinghouse or an expert who keeps track of the prosecutions of voter fraud in the United States? And if they did, what's the status of those prosecutions?
There's not a clearinghouse. I will say that there are some programs that are good at identifying some of the relatively rare fraud we have, such as people voting in two places. People might be registered in two places, and especially across state lines. We used to have before the Bush v. Gore election, we used to have an even more decentralized system where it was almost every county had their own list. Now we've basically got to the point where there are statewide lists, but we're not so good about telling whether somebody might still be left on a list in New Jersey and also in Pennsylvania. And in rare cases, people vote twice. They vote maybe at one home and their summer home, or maybe a college student votes. And those are identified sometimes. I don't want to. I doubt there's. We're talking very large numbers that we're missing, but these programs are between states are affecting some states, and we have some information about them, and we usually have sort of a handful of people that we identify as being in this state and that state who might have voted twice. 5 people in an election, 7 people. We're missing some states. That number might add up to in the hundreds.
So when you say programs, that reminds me of my old job also in state social services, and we would develop programs where we would share information with another state about welfare receipt. Is that what you're talking about? Is 2 officials in 2 different states doing a run to see if my research assistant's name is John Roach. Is John Roach showing up on your list, and he's also on my list? It's a matching exercise. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, generally yes, but then there's some specifics here. So just to go back, I was part of a Presidential Commission on Election Administration, the Bauer-Ginsburg Commission, and back in 2013, and they broadly recommended we should have a lot of this kind of data sharing among states because we've improved the state lists, but we really don't talk that well across state lines. So there is a larger national program, and it's had some. It's voluntary, but it's had some controversy because a number of the Republican states have pulled out of this compact. There's some disagreement. This place called ERIC was meant to share registration and motor vehicle data to determine, A, how many people might be eligible but are not on the list, and they send you a list of those people, and then also to determine duplicates and dead people and others, people who have moved on your list that you might want to look into taking off. A recent controversy, many of the Republican states have pulled out of this. There's some dispute about whether that program was maybe leading too far in the direction of access or integrity, but there are still some of these programs, some one-on-one programs, but some of them more sophisticated, sharing among a number of states, some of them one-on-one between states. And that's what sometimes does yield a few people, a very small number, but a few people who they find in one state registered and in another state, and who voted in the same election,
and
they get prosecuted. Now, again, that's a very small number, but I can't say that all states are covered quite as well. That number would still probably be a pretty small number if we got all the states involved in this. So I don't want to say it's affecting a large-scale election, but that's the type of thing that could be identified by some of these programs.
Okay, so you do the match, and you find that someone's registered in 2 states, same Social Security number, same name, 2 states, or something like that. And it's inadvertent. The person moved, forgot to take himself off the voting list that he was on, registered in a new state, and they didn't match when they did that. And I would think in some cases that's true. They're on the same, they're duplicates, but they're only voting in one place.
Oh, by far the majority of those people are only voting in one place. Yeah. It's a rare case where someone is actually voting twice.
And again, in that particular situation, the person, would they have to show up in both places? I guess they could do a mail ballot to one place and show up in another, a mail ballot to both places.
Right. You could do mail balloting makes it slightly easier to do this, but again, small numbers. Well, one other thing I'll say, we didn't talk about, people make some claims about machine fraud. The machines are somehow tainted and turning votes. And we've seen that. I mean, we've seen that more recently. We actually, on the right, I think we've seen those criticisms maybe 10, 15 years ago, a little bit more on the left. People were very suspicious of machines. I think the suspicion of machines has been good in a certain way. It's kind of kept the machines, people watching the machines and developing the standards in a good way. But there's no evidence that there's been any sort of vote flipping or that there's been interference from outside forces that are changing votes. And I do want to stress that, because 2016, there's this talk and some truth to the fact that Russia and some others were trying to get at our election systems, but they didn't get anywhere near voting machines that cast or tabulate votes. They got to sort of secondary systems, registration systems. And while I am fine with people thinking all about the vulnerabilities of these systems and testing them and trying to hack them in a controlled setting, I do want to stress that I don't think we've seen any real evidence of any outside or really insider problems with machines that have affected vote counts.
Well, the most notorious allegation resulted in a libel settlement from Fox of millions of dollars to a company that was falsely accused of allowing their machine tabulation to be manipulated. Isn't that true?
That's the most recent, and
that was proven to be
and I might
false.
point back to 2004, which people think, well, that wasn't that controversial election. One state, Ohio, determined it. 125,000 votes wasn't that close, and the leader in questioning the machines in those days was somebody named RFK Jr. So we've had a history of people really trying to say the machines are really not good. And just to put some background on it, we should worry about the machines, look at the machines, make sure they're working well. But we've also moved to a system of there being paper backup to the machines in an almost universal way. Not every county, but most places. And so while that doesn't take away all concerns, it will give you a lot more surety that what you do on the machine is actually not being flipped or changed, because you have the physical ballot that you've cast there to look to.
Okay, so let's take another sub-issue, non-citizens. Non-citizens are not permitted to vote in United States elections by federal law, and also state law probably also doubles that up. Are they voting in American elections?
Perhaps in very small numbers, but we don't have evidence of that. We do have evidence of some, again, fairly small numbers of non-citizens getting on to registration rolls. But we have even smaller numbers of people who've ever voted that way. And people point out that it's a serious thing and you might risk deportation, and why would you do that? I will say, I do think in the controversy about what to do about it, there's some efforts to try to, going forward, get people to document that they are citizens in order to get on the voting lists. And I think broadly we could do that pretty well. We could do that in a responsible way, and we probably should do that going forward. Not this election, not in the middle of the election cycle, but for example, at the DMV, many of us are now getting and have gotten these real IDs, which have caused us to prove our citizenship, right? To get on an airplane in a year or so, you're going to need those sort of IDs. It's fairly common for people to have those. And there would be some ways of giving people exemptions if, perhaps if they couldn't find the documentation. I think it's harder to go back and look at the lists, and maybe we should not do that. The current bill in Congress is just looking forward to new people who are registering, getting that done. But even though I don't think there's a large number of people taking advantage of this, there are some reasons to think that there are some more worries that people who are not citizens will get on the list. One, we have more people who are perhaps here who are non-citizens. We have a lot of states that are giving status to giving driver's license, certainly to legal non-citizens, but in some states to people who are here with other statuses. And we have some government programs which are trying to sort of put people on lists a little more automatically. And I think those programs are generally good, but maybe they're not perfect. And we certainly don't want states putting people who are not citizens on the list, and maybe those people getting in trouble because of that. So I think there's some reasons for going forward trying to do that, even if I will make the case that I don't know that there are really more than a handful of cases that one could find.
This one is actually, and as I listen to you talk, this one makes me more concerned because there are two kinds of non-citizens, at least two kinds. Mm-hmm. There are legal non-citizens, and there are a lot of them in the United States, and they are here legally. They're applying for citizenship. They are working. They reside in our communities. They have children in American schools. They may participate in all kinds of every aspect of American life, and they're going to be asked to register to vote by any number of people. And when they go register to vote, all they really have to say is that they're a resident of that community. They prove residency, right?
Well, no, they're gonna swear. They're gonna check a box to say that they are a citizen. Now, you might ask, maybe people are doing that. They're not really paying much attention. Groups might be out there trying to register you, and it's a quick process. And as I mentioned, there are some more affirmative efforts, sort of government efforts to get people on lists. Some people will refer to it as automatic voter registration in some states, which is taking the burden off of you and making the default that when you get your license,
be risky
and others,
because you'd get a lot of people on the list who didn't have to affirm.
It's potentially risky. I think many states are trying to avoid that, but there's a lot more of that. And so I think there are some reasons to think that going forward we could find some good ways to. We're already asking many people who are getting their licenses to provide this information, and DMVs are often sharing that information with election offices, and so I think that would take care of a lot of this. And if there are some things around the edges, like photo ID, of some people who really have these documents.
You're jumping ahead because I get that there's ways to make sure that are emerging to make sure that people have to prove citizenship in order to become registered to vote. I get that, but right now they don't. I mean, they just
they
except
essentially
they
affirm.
have to say they
and
have to affirm.
There's a few exceptions in the states,
but they don't have to show a document. It's a self-attestation
in most places.
Okay, but now let's So the way you've described that to me, and my knowledge of the immigrant community, for instance, in New York, or the immigrant community in other parts of the country, and the way these government entities operate, makes me think it would be pretty easy for a non-citizen to be registered to vote, if they were willing to check the box. And so let's assume that's true, because it is. You check the box, you lie. If you apply for Medicaid or public assistance and you say you have no income, and you do, they do it all the time. So it's not hard for people to lie on a form, and it's really not hard for them to lie on an online application. But let's assume they do that. And so we have non-citizens who are registered to vote and could show up and sign the signature and go in and vote. But we have non-citizens all over America, in every state in America. And we certainly have some places where there are lots of non-citizens, and there is a district attorney or an attorney general or a U.S. attorney who is concerned about this. Do you know of any prosecutions of non-citizens who voted?
I don't know of any. I
Now
suspect there's a
that's
small number.
remarkable
But
to me.
I
No,
don't
I
follow
have to
this way.
stop
But
that. I
I
have
will
to
say
stop
there's
the
not
conversation right there.
certainly not large numbers.
No,
Let's put
no,
it that way.
but that's remarkable to me. You are the foremost expert on this, and you have no knowledge of a prosecution anywhere in America. You can't think of one of a non-citizen for voting. That's amazing.
Yeah, although
I want to tell you what it's amazing to me. It's not amazing about. It's amazing to me that what are all these red state attorney generals and red state district attorneys doing? If it's a real problem, you'd think they'd do something about it, but apparently they're not. There's absolutely zero, as far as you know.
I am not aware of them, but I know if they are there, I think they're there in small numbers. I am aware, and again, this is a different case, but just to be clear, when we do some cleaning of the voting lists, and I actually don't know the period of time we're talking about, but Texas recently, and it talked about all the people they removed for good reason. They've moved, they've died.
Yeah.
They found 6,800 people who were non-citizens on their list and removed. Again, I can't tell you if that's over the last year or the last 4 years. I have to go back and look at that.
Okay,
but,
some got on.
People get on, and it might be taken advantage. Might be taken advantage of by other people. Probably rare.
And by the way, being on doesn't necessarily mean they voted.
Very, very likely, very unlikely that they did vote, but
Really?
but possible.
Really?
Not unlikely.
Huh.
But unlikely.
So I think it's a legitimate concern, but I also would put it on the law enforcement entities in the various states to prosecute it and prove that it's a legitimate concern by actually having a conviction.
Yep.
Be nice to have that. I mean, because it would let you know whether it's real.
Well, I will say, often how they come to prosecutors is through election officials finding something, right? So they are referring this to prosecutors when they say, well, okay, we've got a program that can identify people in 2 states, and now somehow there's been some coordination. We've figured out that they voted twice. We're going to send it to this, or in the case of felons as well. And I'm guessing that there have been these prosecutions. I don't follow them in that way, so I will say it's at a very small number at this point.
All right. All right. Before we go to another topic, which is rules changes, sort of goes to the access side of the issue, I want to just ask you this. In some respects, the legitimacy of our constitutional system is dependent on our faith in the election process, because we are a self-governing country, and the way we execute our self-government responsibilities is by voting. It's 2024. Do you think Americans should question the legitimacy of their system because the voting is so fraught with fraud?
No, I don't think they should question it. I think we are in a good place. Now, we're not in a perfect place. We're a big country. We've got lots of diversity. There are issues we can still keep talking about. But I think in several respects. One, we've improved our voting systems dramatically, I would say, since 2000 and the Bush v. Gore decision, where a number of things in the voting machines and voter registration and processes broadly and that allow provisional votes, all sorts of things, they've improved. Two, 2020 was an extraordinary time with all sorts of conditions that we will not see this time, thank goodness. And that caused a lot of stress on the system. I don't think it's, at the end of the day, I think we did a pretty good job of running an election under these terrible circumstances. But these questions of last-minute changes, emergencies, very, very different views in the American people about the pandemic, or whether you could go out, but that related to voting, whether it was safe to go to a polling place or whether you had to allow lots of voting by mail. Who made those decisions? All of those things sort of exacerbated the tensions and caused more litigation. At the end of the day, I think we did what we did. We did it pretty well, and you had to kind of come to a certain kind of closure and say, we ran the election under these circumstances, and there's a final result. But that tension, I think, will not be here in a more normal election. People will still argue. I don't want to say we're going to have a perfect time, but I think that makes me much more confident that things will go well in this election. because we're under much more normal circumstances.
So what you're referring to in 2020, because of the pandemic, states changed their rules, including fairly late in the process, to make it much easier to vote without as much checks on their identity. But the rules were changed, and did those rules? Would you say, as an expert, that those rule changes contributed to a higher than expected turnout?
We had the highest turnout in modern history.
So they did.
Well, I'm a little more skeptical that the
Really?
rules themselves. Look, every state, from the most conservative to the most liberal, did some changes that so-called liberalized their ability to vote, whether it was giving you more time to cast an absentee ballot, or in some cases radically changing from essentially a polling place state to one that did almost all mail. I mean, there were all sorts of changes and all sorts of arguments. But at the end of the day, I do think that what we've seen since 2004 has been really the highest turnout in elections, in much higher than the year 20, 30 years before. And I think the main reason for that is the intensity of
Our
the
polarization.
contest,
Yeah.
right? That we care very deeply. We're polarized, and polarization, while it is not a good thing in many ways, it probably does lead to higher turnout in a lot of ways. And 2020 was supercharged in that way. And one of the reasons I say that is because a lot of the evidence on voting by mail or voting early in person, and I'm actually more in favor of the voting early in person and rather than moving to all by mail, but you could argue it either way. The changes in turnout from those are relatively small or non-existent, right? It tends to be moving voters around. People like it. It's more convenient, but it hasn't had a dramatic
Really?
effect by itself.
Really?
But what I think really has pushed things is our intense atmosphere and we were at home in the pandemic.
But that's legitimate. I mean, that's
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah,
And
that's
I
what
mean, I
happened.
guess you could say that's a very robust, sometimes intense, but system that people that care very much about going to the polls, sometimes because they care about their own candidates or they don't like the other one, and that is driving turnout more.
But you I think you hinted that there needs to be a role for mail-in voting.
Sure.
In the traditional absentee, maybe even more than that. But you really do prefer in-person voting, or do you have a take on that? What's your take?
Well, first, I am a defender of federalism, so I'm okay the fact that we have 50 states and we're doing different things. Now, if you put me in charge of a state, I guess I would be more comfortable. And I wrote an AEI book years ago on absentee and early voting, and of course, we need voting by mail for people who need it. But the move to early voting, a significant period, doesn't have to be super long, but long enough to give people an opportunity to vote early. That's a big convenience, and you have the protections of the polling place. There are states like that. I was just in North Carolina. North Carolina does a lot of early voting in person, some election day voting, and has relatively strict rules for voting by mail. That would probably be my preference. But the states look very different out there, and there's absolutely a role for mail voting in every state. And some of the states that do a lot of mail voting also have thought a lot about what they do about them. The states I tend to be worried about are the ones who are quickly moving to lots of voting by mail without really thinking about how all the mechanisms fit in, and not really developing all that they need to develop before they do that.
Okay, now let's talk about counting. What is going on with counting? Why do we have election offices that say they can't give you the numbers until a week later?
Well, it's interesting. We've seen this development over the last 30 years, and a simple answer is, although it needs some more explanation, is that we have a lot more voting by mail. Now, by itself, a state might do well with a lot of voting by mail if they did some other things. But if you went to the New York Times on a Thursday morning 30 years ago and you looked at the presidential results, you would have seen nearly all of the votes reported unofficially, not the official certified election, but you would have seen a total that was very, very close to it. We've seen that drop and drop and drop over the last 30 years.
You mean Thursday morning after a Tuesday election?
Yes. And there was a person who did a study using this, so this is what we're using as a measure, and that gave a little bit of time for a day of gathering the results, and we knew. Now, Many states, still might meet that. State of Florida, I will say, Florida used to be made fun of back in Bush v. Gore. It had a lot of scrutiny. It's actually a pretty good system now. They produce their results very quickly. But here's the thing. You want to have the ballots available to be counted on Election Day, or by Election Day at least, or even before Election Day in some cases. But anything that's sort of left over, either late arriving votes by mail, we have now some provisional ballots, which are allowed to voters who might have a problem at the polling place. Sometimes they need to be resolved. We sometimes give people time to resolve their mistakes they've made on the ballots that come later. We've done a number of things that push some ballots later in the process or even past Election Day, and so we're not ready to count them. And so just to tweak the right and the left a little bit, the right is a little bit cautious and sometimes against some of this idea of pre-processing, not exactly counting, but almost counting the absentee ballots before Election Day. So a ballot will arrive, and you'll have to look at the envelope. And first you'll have to determine, well, did Robert Dorn make a mistake on this?
Yeah.
Is this, and maybe there's a law that says you should contact Robert Dorn and see if he can fix that. And if you're certain that this is eligible to be cast, you can then open the ballot. Once you do that, put it in a machine. You might even run it through the machine to not count finally, but to have it registered what it is. So it's prepared. It's ready when you press the button on Election Day to actually be counted.
Well,
so we want that.
Prohibition about counting before Election Day?
There are different rules in different places, and I would say in states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, they've been reluctant to do that. Republicans have been reluctant to do that. And look, I think it's important that procedure if you have a lot of vote by mail. If you don't have a lot of vote by mail, I guess I think you probably could deal with it. There are probably some other states that deal with it.
Okay,
well,
but
for
stop,
other reasons.
John. Stop. What you're saying is that the main reason we don't get results on election night or the day after is because there's way more vote by mail, and most places don't start counting them till after the election. And some of the vote by mail comes in late.
Yeah. One reason is that, and I would say another reason is there are some states, the majority of states, require you to get the ballot in by Election Day. A minority of states, but some of them large states, say you can have your ballot postmarked by Election Day and it will come in X number of days.
Yeah.
Or the other thing they might do is to say you have a period of time to cure your absentee ballot mistake. So if there's a problem with your absentee ballot, you have even till 5, 6, 7 days after the election. Again, a provisional ballot, a similar idea that you might have 6 or 7 days. The more, and that's my tweak of the left. The left is often wants to say, we should let the ballots come in as late as possible with this. If you had the ballot due on Election Day and you did some pre-processing, that would likely take care of a fair amount. Occasionally, there's some other things that cause provisional ballots, but having those ballots ready to be counted quickly and done Election Day can be done. But a state that does a lot of vote by mail, unless they do it right, is risking taking a little longer counting the votes.
One last on this counting. So we've got all the election districts counting, and they've got these. It takes longer or shorter, and it's all coming in. Meanwhile, we have media entities and analysts evaluating, early returns or early state returns, and using science, their own science, it's a science, to predict what this all means even before all the ballots are cast on the day of the election. And I actually think there some movement to prohibit them from calling elections before all the polls are closed, but I don't know there isn't a federal statute on that, is there?
There is not, no.
And how will you feel if some smarty pants at the New York Times, because North Carolina goes unexpectedly high for Harris versus Trump, decides, well, that means that all these other less conservative states are going to be even more for Harris, and Harris is declared the winner before the polls are closed in California? Will you not like that? Is that a bad thing?
Yeah, I think that's a bad thing. I guess I have some confidence in the media. There's been some restraint. In fact, I think probably more restraint on the side of waiting for an absolute result. And I also think Again, 2020 was such a strange election from two perspectives. One, from the state's perspective themselves. They had many more vote by mail. They had all sorts of things they weren't used to doing, so maybe they took longer. But then the analysts also were not ready for the record turnout, the different modes of turnout, and didn't follow patterns. And so I think we were suitably cautious in 2020, and where it took multiple days till they actually had the network call it. I wouldn't be surprised to see it called on election night, maybe late into the night or the next day. I think those are probably the most two likely things, and I think that would likely be legitimate unless it's extremely close or something. There's some sort of real hang-up in a key state.
Okay, last question. Let's just talk about the changes in access. Are the changes the Supreme Court has made with regard to the interpretation of the 1965 Voting Rights Act and its amendments cause you any concern at all?
Broadly, I don't think it's had a particularly significant effect. I think several things were going on at the same time. I think we had states improve their voting systems pretty dramatically over the years, and when states in the South and some other places were under special provisions that they were watched over by either Justice Department or courts, there were real reasons for that. The court especially called into question that Congress was really relying on some very, very old data as to looking to why we were treating these states differently than others. So the court now doesn't, and we don't oversee every little change of polling place or change of voting procedure in the way we did in certain states. Now, that also happened around the same time as some of these southern states were getting Republican majorities in their state legislatures. And yes, they are moving towards somewhat more conservative election policies. And people sort of put two and two together and think, oh, it's, the end of the world. I think many states are running really quite well. There are other provisions to allow people to go in and get at problems of people denying access in states if needed. So while this regime served us very well, and we came from a very bad place to a much better place, I think we're many of these states that were formerly covered under the formula are places that run pretty good elections. Again, I'll point to Florida. Florida elections are really some of the best, and they do some very innovative things. And that's not to say you couldn't question this or that move of a polling place, but the idea that they would need to be under special scrutiny rather than X other state, I think, would be outdated.
Okay, one more because I can't resist. We've done election integrity, we've done voting, we've done counting. What about the drawing of the districts and partisan gerrymandering? If of all these issues, is that an issue you think is actually the most important and one we really need the most reform? Or is it one you also think, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't think it's the most important. I also think, we're in a different place than we were. One, we've had a number of states, not all, but a number of states have been experimenting. Some of them have certain commissions that are drawing nonpartisan lines and bipartisan drawings of lines, and so there's a number of I don't have the number now, but it's not an insignificant number of states that are drawing lines that way. You also do see we still have a regime where we are still drawing majority minority districts in significant ways in places that have significant populations. I know people can argue about whether maybe we should do it slightly more in some states, and you saw the courts really step in later times in Alabama and Louisiana in this election and create essentially a second majority minority district. So we still have some of that, and people worried about the fairness of that, I think still have that. I think if you hate the idea that parties can ever have some say over drawing lines, we are still a country that does a fair amount of that, right?
Yes.
We're not like the rest of the world. But it's spread relatively equally across a number of states. I think there are a lot of places that you still can't accomplish everything you want with a majority. It's a lot harder than you think to draw the perfect map. And I don't think we saw a particular lean of the Congress left or right in this election, particularly because of gerrymandering in the way that we had in the past.
Okay, we've covered election integrity, we've covered voting access, we've covered gerrymandering, and we've covered voting rights. That's a lot in one one-on-one with Robert Doar. So thank you very much, John, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Robert.